The best of Money Matters. The Big Story.
Welcome to The Big Story. I'm Hongbin Jeong. We're now 1 week away from nomination day on April 23rd and 17 days away from polling day on May 3rd. Since the dissolution of Parliament, we've seen political parties spring into action, from fielding new candidates, hitting the ground early, and unveiling fresh manifestos and policy ideas. But this year's general election also unfolds under a new digital reality. For the first time, laws have been introduced to curb the spread of false or digitally altered content that misrepresents candidates, including deepfakes and manipulated media. And with so much campaigning now happening online, how might these new rules impact the ways parties communicate and engage with voters? Could this shift reshape how political trust is built or broken for this year's election? Well, to explore more about this, joining us today is Dr. Felix Tan, who is an independent political observer and analyst. Hi, Dr. Tan. Thank you so much for joining me this evening.
Hi, very good evening.
All right. Dr. Tan, Prime Minister Lawrence Wong has said that he has called a general election now as the world is undergoing profound changes, becoming more uncertain, unsettled, and even unstable. And Singaporeans have to decide on the team that should lead the nation. But, Dr. Tan, should we be seeking change in leadership during such a time where we're seeing profound changes, or should we stick to the status quo based on what we've established the past 5 years?
I think when we talk about seeking change in leadership, it's always sort of a fear factor because things are still evolving very much so. But I think there isn't much of a choice at this point in time because we have to have an election to be called this year anyway. Right. And also, I think if we look at how Singapore has dealt with some of the many global upheavals before, like September 11th, we got global financial crisis. This time round, I think it will simply test our endurance to counter these changes. But should we stick to the status quo? Well, I think the important question here to all Singaporeans and voters, are we ready for change and for alternatives? We are seeing a lot more new faces this time round. Right. And the global environment has changed also very much drastically. And of course, I think PM Lawrence Wong has talked about how the institutions are not working and so on and so forth. So I think these are important things that we have to look at.
Well, Dr. Tan, the 2020 general election was held in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, and the 2025 general election comes at a time of global uncertainty. So will the effective crisis management of 2020 kind of translate a competitive edge to the incumbent in 2025, or do the new global uncertainties risk reshaping voter expectations and political loyalty in Singapore?
I think on hindsight, right, it would certainly seem that the crisis management of 2020 would certainly come in handy, the experience that they have gotten, the team that have weathered through the entire pandemic. But I think, what we have to see is that what transpired then is very much different compared to what we are seeing today. And there will always be global uncertainties, and the best that Singapore can do is to, do the best to mitigate this economic fallout that might come along with it. But I think, voters' expectations and sentiments are not always predicated on what happens around the world. So they tend to be more inward-looking, more insular, and many are just looking at the most immediate concerns, such as rising costs and transport costs, education, and housing. So these are the important things that will concern them. We talk about political loyalty. Well, that didn't really happen in 2020 if you look at the general election then, despite a looming or pandemic and crisis. So one would suppose that sort of sentiments will continue.
Well, those are some great points there, Dr. Tan. But what have you noticed some of the key differences from this election to the previous years? Are there any differences?
Well, I think for one, from the last general election, obviously we are not under a pandemic situation, so that's first and foremost something that is a shift. Perhaps we are seeing a return to previous sort of campaigning strategies and elections. But I think some of the differences that we'll see from this is that, firstly, there are many, many more new faces. I think it's one of the largest that the PAP has actually put forth in terms of new faces. But just besides the PAP itself, if you look across all the other political opposition parties as well, there are also many, many new faces and many candidates. And secondly, I think the number of high-profile candidates, ranging from senior civil servants to senior counsels and to former directors, psychologists, etc., etc. I think there are a lot more high-profile candidates this time around. And I think thirdly, the competition seems to have gotten much fiercer this time, and with more political parties. And I think we are seeing more multi-cornered fights, not just within the GRCs, but also the SMCs.
Well, as an independent political observer here, Dr. Tan, what are some lessons the ruling party as well as the opposition parties can learn from the previous election to sway the voters?
Well, clearly there are many lessons one can learn from the past, but I think how many of them are willing to change, and that's an important question. They seem to return back to the old ways, the old things of doing things, because it has worked before. But I think firstly, political parties need to be able to articulate their views as clearly as possible. Essentially, they have to reach to the voters and not just for the manifesto and stick with their manifesto. What exactly are they trying to say? It's about persuasion, the art of persuasion. So they need to do that. Secondly, I think very importantly, and we hope to see that party members or candidates refrain from character assassinations. It's always easy to paint their opponents, wherever they might be, in a very bad light, simply for political gains. But, one wonder whether it has worked. The younger voters, we have to understand that these days are more savvy, more media savvy, and are very aware of such, I would say, gimmicks. And I think thirdly, we have also to understand, rallies do not translate to votes. And while and there is a need to use these platforms, but, they have to use them effectively, essentially.
Fair enough. Well, since the parliament was dissolved and the writ of election was issued yesterday, parties have unveiled their lineups for the election. I mean, with nomination day just a week away, Dr. Tan, what can we expect from the different parties? What should voters be looking out for?
For sure, one thing, the competition is beginning to heat up. I think a lot of them have already come out to talk about their manifesto. So there are many other political parties putting the final touches to the teams that they would want to place in the different constituencies. So I think essentially voters should question these candidates, scrutinize them very, very carefully. I mean, let's not dox them. We'll come to that later. Importantly, how are these candidates aligning with your values, and what policies do they have? How are they going to serve your interests? Are they realistic? Are they rational? But importantly, I think study the character of the individual candidates very, very carefully.
Well, once we hit nomination day, there will be 9 days to campaign till cooling off day. How will parties then ramp up their campaigning in those 9 days? How do you think the length of time influences the strategic approach of parties in winning voters?
I think if you look at, the campaigning strategy, a lot of them will definitely shift towards social media. And so what we will see is that the social media presence in the coming days, will be amped up. So the more that their presence is felt online, perhaps the better it is for some of these political parties. Unfortunately, many of the opposition parties can only really rely on social media to up their game, because they might not have the resources that will allow them to do anything else beyond social media. And after all, the coverage that they might have on certain mediums are also very, very limited.
Well, based on what we've seen in the build-up of the elections this year, Dr. Tan, which constituency will you be keeping an eye on?
I think I would definitely say Jurong West Coast GRC. I mean, the PSP has been trying to gain more inroads there, and it was an area that was hotly contested. But I would not keep my hopes too high over there as well. But I mean, it will be hotly contested. The other few, I would say Marine Parade, Brother Heights GRC, East Coast GRC, and of course, I think the new GRC, Ponko GRC. These will be areas that we'll want to keep my eyes on. And as for SMC, I think one of the more interesting one, I would say, is the Bukit Panjang SMC. And that's between SDP's Paul Tambia and PAP's incumbent Liang Eng-hua. I think the two of them has gone head-to-head in the last GE. And I think Liang Eng-hua has said that, Paul Tambia has, gotten quite strong and has quite a lot of voters there.
All right. Well, amongst those, I want to dive in deeper into the East Coast GRC, because Dr. Edwin Tong said the PAP doesn't take everything for granted, and added that every vote will be vital. Looking at the previous general election here, the PAP narrowly edged the WP in East Coast. This year, do you think we can expect a tighter than usual battle again?
I think we might see a tighter than usual battle again. But I think one will have to look at the situation, because who will the Workers' Party put in there to contest the constituency? I mean, the last time for East Coast GRC, we had Nicosia star power, a lot of influence, a lot of hype around that individual. So there was a star power there. But right now, who will the Workers' Party put in place? And will they have the same sort of clout, the influence that will be able to allow voters to gravitate to the Workers' Party? So it will be a tough fight in the East Coast GRC, but it really depends on who the Workers' Party will be putting to contest in that area.
But looking at East Coast's electoral history here, do you think the opposition sees this winnable GRC this round? I mean, what do you think they will do to kind of tip the balance into their favor this time around?
Well, East Coast GRC, no matter how small the vote shared in the last general election was, I think it seems to be a stronghold of the PAP. So I think the PAP will have kind of like more favorable towards them. But I think, especially now, if you look at the PAP has this. Finally, they have this East Coast plan, and it's aptly titled East Side, Best Side, and they have lots of details on the website. You read it up, interactive maps showing, the facilities, how they're going to talk about the community spaces, and, many other different areas for improvement in East Coast. But I think, what we have to look at is one wonders whether these are just mere superficial enhancements to the constituency. While it would certainly benefit the residents there, and I'm sure many would be enticed by such plans, what can the opposition now put forth? I think that's more important, or what might tip the balance is what the party essentially stands for. I think there's a need for something more substantive, and, such cosmetic changes might only last for a short term. But, people often like what's on the surface anyway.
Well, speaking of the Workers' Party here, Aljunied and Sengkang are the opposition WP strongholds. Given their lead and their performance in the GRCs in the past few years, will the WP come back on top again?
I think we have to understand this. For any opposition political party, every election cycle is never a given that they will be voted back in again. Well, maybe with the exception of Hougang, but even that, opposition parties always had it tough. So there are certainly no promises that the Workers' Party will come up top again. They will have to do their utmost or their best to convince voters in these constituencies that they have been the best for them, despite the odds against them every election. And it also depends on how confident voters are with these candidates in these constituencies.
Right. Well, Dr. Tan, earlier in our conversation, you spoke about how voters are more media savvy and you see a lot, and we can expect a lot of political parties to be campaigning on social media. Well, it seems like the Elections Department has introduced a new law banning fake or digitally altered online material that misrepresents candidates and will be in place for the first time this general election. How significant do you think the introduction of this new law is to this year's election? Do you think this was a preemptive step to safeguard political integrity before any misinformation spreads?
If we all read a little bit about the new law, it's rather comprehensive and very detailed. Well, if looking at it, there are many restrictions when it comes to online misinformation and, of course, how you use campaigning for online. But I think, at the end of the day, misinformation deepfakes as such can still spread despite the law against them. But what needs to be done is that, political parties need to be vigilant as well. And also not only the authorities, to monitor the spread of these insidious words, of misinformation. I think essentially everyone needs to be on their toes, especially political parties, to watch out for such misinformation, because while the law is there to ensure political integrity, to safeguard, the authorities can only do so much, and authorities might not want to make certain presumptions that, such misinformation necessarily are perpetrated by political parties alone, but some lone individuals as well.
Well, how might these new regulations affect the parties then, especially those who rely heavily on online campaigning? Does this new regulation pose a risk to their campaign efforts?
I think political parties will complain, all right? They will talk about how unfair it is. But I think at the end of the day, everyone needs to stay vigilant. While the regulations are rather comprehensive and detailed, what political parties must be aware are of the final details. we can always say that it's uneven playing field, but it's always going to be the case. So between the spread of misinformation and being creative by how you can work around these laws without breaking them, of course, I think, one might want to go for the latter instead.
Right. Well, that was a great conversation with you, Dr. Tan. Thank you so much for your time and your insights today.
You're welcome.
Thank you. That was Dr. Felix Tan, an independent political observer and analyst. This has been The Big Story with me, Hongbin Jeong.
To listen to more great interviews, download our podcasts at audio.sg or download the audio app. That's AWEDIO, audio at the App Store and Google Play.